Cool, thank you very much. I guess it's traditional for firstly to ask everyone can hear me, right? Um, so I want to talk a little bit about government surveillance in the context of obviously of South Africa. A lot of comrades who especially who've come through the Right to Know or other movements are familiar with government surveillance of protest movements of civil society. And I'll speak a little bit kind of in the context of South Africa and Southern Africa. Obviously, the situation varies from region to region. And before I do anything else, I have to cough. Excuse me, comrades. So I think there was one important point that was made in the previous discussion that is relevant to this one, which is that when we talk about state surveillance, it's often really, the state is in many ways in the digital sphere not nearly as powerful as private interests. And it's important to remember, and I forget this myself, that when we talk about state surveillance, we're often talking about digital surveillance that is run off the back of private networks and private services. And very often, sometimes that is private networks and services like your software, your devices, your network infrastructure, which is being used by the state for surveillance without the knowledge of those or without the power or participation of those, the entities owning those or running those devices. But very often it is the state relying on private companies to give them that service, either because they're legally required to, or because they're being paid to. In South Africa, that's certainly true, but it's also true for even the most powerful and sophisticated surveillance states. It's worth remembering that Edward Snowden, who is obviously probably the most well-known surveillance whistleblower, was not an employee of the US government. He was an outsourced worker for the US intelligence agencies. So, even the NSA is using private contractors. Now, I think it's important for us, I tend to try to remind comrades about how unreliable state surveillance is how, I think it's important that we keep two things in our mind. And the one is that the state and its sort of partners can be invasive, unethical, and anti-democratic. But that doesn't always mean that they actually know what's going on. State surveillance can be invasive and kind of crap at the same time. And as much as we sometimes conjure up the idea of an all-knowing state, Big Brother. Big Brother is always watching, but isn't necessarily always knowing. And we've seen this even in the kind of intelligence reports that are leaked about protest movements in South Africa, even, sometimes the movements we're part of, is that the intelligence that is being leaked from what the state thinks is going on is often kind of like a little bit bogus and confused. And that isn't necessarily reassuring, right? Because there's the only thing more worrying than a state that is all-knowing and all-powerful is a state that is kind of like slightly ignorant and all-powerful. Now, within the South African context, in the sort of transition from the Zuma era of the state to the Ramaphosa era of the state, there have been big changes in the intelligence agencies in South Africa. Not necessarily as many changes as we need, but there are significant changes in a few different ways. And the one is that the state security agencies have shown themselves to be completely involved in politicized spying, both at the elite level of politics and also at the grassroots level of protest movements and civic organizations. But they've also found themselves they've been shown really to be unreliable and untrustworthy, not just in relation to the people, but actually in relation to the state as well. The political kind of the political clients of the state security agency, which is basically kind of politicians and government leaders, have good reason not to trust the intelligence agencies. And then secondly, that those agencies have been, and people sort of employed there have been shown to be kind of involved in a great deal of financial corruption and maladministration, which means that there are more checks and balances and less available cash to them to spend it how they want. And what this means is that they've got a little, okay, so those are the kind of administrative context. And then secondly, we know that there's been this big constitutional court judgment last year that has tightened some of how our surveillance law, RICA, operates to improve oversight, improve oversight from judges and transparency, and close down some of the spying. Now, what that means is that there's less official latitude for the intelligence agencies now than there necessarily would have been, a couple of years ago. But what that means, I think, it's partly good, and it is also very much the result of activism against state surveillance. So we can hold it up as a victory, but it has some unintended consequences as well. Now, in the global south and in Southern Africa in particular, there's basically, in my mind, three kind of major kind of partners to state surveillance. And the one is the network operators. I'm sure that there's more than three. I'm just going to list the three. The one is the network operators like your MTNs, your Vodafones. In some parts of Southern Africa, it's Orange, which is a French-owned network company. And then there's state-owned networks in many of these countries as well. So that's one, network operators. The second is kind of foreign industry partners who are usually in the US, in Europe, in China, to some extent, to a lesser extent in India, and obviously local providers as well in some cases. And so these are basically software service providers who create the infrastructure that state surveillance can run on. And then the third is these kind of spyware partners. And these are usually, these are basically people who sell as a service software that can hack an individual's device or phone to get around some of the improvements in encryption that we see. So that's basically things like Israeli-made spyware like Pegasus and Circles, which are being operated in some of the countries neighboring South Africa, and European spyware that we might have heard of like FinFisher. Now, the thing about that spyware is it's probably the most scary stuff that we're thinking about at the moment when we talk about state surveillance. It is incredibly invasive. It's being used against opposition politicians, against journalists, against human rights activists in Southern Africa. But it's also incredibly expensive. And so in some ways, a lot of this most invasive software, the biggest control against it is just the states can't really afford it to be as invasive as they would like to be. And with the network operators, generally, and there's an increasing trend towards wherever a government agency wants to use information that it gets from a network operator, it needs to go through a court and get the permission of a judge, which is a good form of oversight. But the problem is that we see this general trend towards better regulation of surveillance in South Africa and the region. It's not good, but I'm saying it's better than it was. But what we haven't done as effectively is clamp down on the politics of surveillance, the fundamental instinct of states and of political structures to spy. And so as much as they can't use all the tools that have necessarily been available to them in the way that they would like to, those agencies are still going to be drawn to try to gather information on their populations. And we see this in South Africa, particularly, with protest groups, with civic movements. That is going to continue. With media organizations, that is going to continue. But the tools that might have been available previously are going to be less accessible more and more. And what the result is that I think that as we've improved regulation, but not necessarily improve the climate in which surveillance happens, these agencies are going to go look for new loopholes that aren't covered in the regulation. So for example, there's going to be potentially a greater use of informants, which is one of the primary uses already, is that, trying to infiltrate movements by sitting in public meetings, by, willingly or wittingly or unwittingly getting information from people who are in those movements, by putting undercover operatives in those movements. That will be potentially an avenue that is still open to them and that they will use more. They might use, kind of second-rate or third-rate service providers, because if you can't afford Israeli-made software, go find someone who's cooked it up themselves in a university lab. they may start to try to use more information from data leaks, for example. And they may start paying off, or continue, who knows, to pay off employees in the services that that they require to leak information kind of unlawfully. And we've already seen that being used by private investigators. If anyone's interested, going right to buy someone's cell phone records from, you know, from like an MTN, is surprisingly small amount of money. It's like 2,500 Rand to get someone's phone records, you know, based off of previous abuses. So these are the kinds of mechanisms that increasingly we're going to see being used. And I think that if the conversation is about what needs to be done, there's lots of things that we can do to tackle, you know, to improve the technology that we use, to improve the security of the space. And I think that's very important. But clearly technological and legal solutions are really only part of the struggle. And we need to continue conversations like this. We need to continue movement building around, you know, against a politics of surveillance, to ensure that those parts of society, whether it's the state or the private sector, that are fundamentally drawn towards spying and surveillance and documentation and analysis, realize that the political costs are too high and the space for them to do so shrinks and shrinks. And that is really, that's part of the mission of building a safer internet and actually building a free internet, is that political work. And I think in the interest of time, I can pause it here. I'd be happy to speak about all of this in more detail, and would love to hear more from other people. Thanks, Comrade Mike.